The wind curled through the slanted wooden shutters of the baker's hut, whispering secrets into the warmth. The boy stood still, fingers cold against the stone ledge, eyes fixed on the tray of wafers that steamed gently in the hush. The scent of honeyed oats clung to the air, soft and golden. But beneath it, the sharper tang of iron drifted from the village forge, metal and fire, muscle and flame. His mother moved slowly beside the hearth, her shadow dancing on the soot-streaked walls. Her lips moved in silent rhythm, shaping old prayers in Old French, half for mercy, half for memory. The fire cracked, soft and constant. She did not look at him, but she knew. She always knew when he reached. His hand hovered near the cake dusted with cinnamon. It glowed in the dim light like a treasure unearthed from ash. But her hand rose, a gentle stop, and he pulled back. No words. Just the weight of understanding. That cake was not for him. Not for hands like his. It belonged to the bishop. To holy mouths. To silk and rings and tables of silver. Not to skin rough with wood splinters. The hunger that twisted inside him was not new. It had lived with him, slept beside him, walked in the folds of his tunic. Hunger shaped him. Not the kind that gnawed the stomach, but the kind that carved the soul. The hunger to belong. To be seen. To taste what was always just beyond reach. Outside, the bell in the chapel tower rang, once, low and heavy. A monk passed in silence, crumbs brushing from his habit as if they were ash. A group of nuns passed nearby, cloaks drawn tight, sharing slices of dried apple hidden in their palms. Boys sat near the well, dipping barley bread into salted brine, laughing with mouths too wide for their thin cheeks. But in the baker's hut, there was only the boy, the wafers, and the space between. The silence felt sacred, stretched tight like thread before it snapped. The fire burned low. Shadows climbed the walls. He watched the cakes rise in slow breath, the cinnamon darkening at the edges. They were beautiful, fragile discs of sugar and flour, layered with labor. Made for others. Behind him, a wooden spoon hung limp on a frayed rope. It bore the scars of fire, the stain of honey. Its curve bent from years of stirring, scraping, and feeding. A small thing, almost invisible, but it had seen everything. It was his mother's story, his grandmother's hands, his lineage carved in wood. A relic of the quiet work done in corners. He turned to it. Let his fingers brush its worn handle. There was comfort in it, somehow. Even as his belly ached. Even as the wafers cooled, his mother folded a cloth around the tray and lifted it with care. Take this, she whispered, and he did, though his arms shook. He would carry it across the village to the bishop's house. Through the mud. Through the stairs. Through the ache of knowing he would smell the sugar but never taste it. The path was uneven, the morning sharp with winter's bite. But he walked. Past the nuns, past the forge, past the boys by the well. A dog barked. A crow called out from a rooftop, wings beating once and gone. The tray in his hands trembled, but he held it level. At the bishop's door, he waited. A servant took the tray with a nod that meant nothing. No thank you. No coin. No eye contact. The door closed. He stood there a moment longer, then turned back. The path home felt longer. The hunger is louder. But when he stepped into the hut, his mother was still at the griddle, still stirring, still praying. She looked at him. Said nothing, but placed a crust of warm barley bread in his hand. No cinnamon. No honey. Just bread, hard at the edges, soft in the center. He ate it in silence. Outside, pigeons clattered on the roof beams. Smoke rose in thin spirals from a dozen chimneys. And somewhere, across the fields, a bell rang again. Lighter this time, like a question left unanswered. A woman sat alone, breath blooming like pale smoke before her, wrapped in the chill silence of the cloister. The bench beneath her was rimmed with frost, its stone surface biting through wool, yet she did not shift. Stillness was part of the ritual now, of waiting, of remembering, of daring. In her lap, wrapped in linen folded and refolded like a prayer cloth, lay 3 small almond pastries. Pale gold, crescent-shaped, their edges pinched like whispered secrets, their scent faint beneath the cold. Honey, rosewater, crushed almonds, fragile luxuries in hard times. Each one a story baked into softness. And she, the keeper of these crumbs of memory, held them like relics. The bells called out from the convent tower behind her, slow and heavy, like footsteps on stone. Not for mass, not for feast, these bells mourned. What exactly, no one ever said aloud. But every woman in earshot knew what it meant when the bell tolled like that. It was always something that had once breathed and now would not again. She did not cry. Not because she lacked sorrow, but because she had already wept it dry over 5 winters. 5 long years since her sister's voice had last touched her ears. 5 winters since the ribbon vanished from her trunk, and with it, her trust. A ribbon first, then a secret, then her voice, stolen, like breath in the snow. But there had been a time before all that, when they had knelt side by side at their mother's knee, watching her hands press the same pastries into shape. Their mother's fingers dusted with flour, her psalter always nearby. The recipe, scrawled in the margins of a saint's page, a blend of spirit and sweetness, was sacred. A secret between them, passed down not with ceremony but with quiet glances and shared silence. And now, the silence between them was all that remained. She had found the old recipe again while cleaning a trunk for the winter, brown ink faded, the note about St. Agnes barely legible beside the almond paste instructions. Her hands had trembled, and something ancient stirred in her chest. A small defiance against forgetting. Almonds were rare now. The trade routes had shifted, and the price was too high for most. She had bartered her last bit of clean linen, soft and embroidered with her own initials, to the miller's wife just to afford a handful. The honey came from the abbey's own stores. The rosewater she begged from the apothecary's assistant in exchange for mending a torn hem. She had made them slowly, carefully, alone, shaping them like folded letters, sealing each one with a clove. A peace offering, a prayer. The cold nipped at her cheeks, but her thoughts burned warm. She remembered the last time she had seen her sister's face, not through the grill of the scriptorium, but in full light. Her jaw set, eyes hard, the ribbon clenched in her fist. Neither of them had spoken. Their mother had already passed. The psalter had gone to the abbey, and the silence between them grew roots, deep and wide. She had imagined this day 100 times. What she would say, what she would demand, what she would confess. But none of it felt right now. Now there was only the cold, the linen bundle, and the door at IT creaked open. The sound echoed like a blade drawn slowly. She did not look up at once. Instead, she exhaled, and then rose. A figure stepped through the doorway. Smaller than she remembered. The veil was pulled low, and the woman's hands were red with ink, stained from hours copying psalms or penitential chants. Her sister's eyes found hers, and for a breath too long, neither moved. Then, a step, the woman with the pastries held out the bundle. Her hands shook, not from fear, from memory. "I found Mother's ledger," she said softly. Her voice caught, like thread in a needle's eye. "And I remembered your favorite." The sister did not answer at first. She only reached out and took the cloth, cradling it in both hands as if it were a living thing. The scent of honey rose into the cold air. Behind her, the convent door remained ajar, casting a blade of gold across the ground. That no forgiveness was spoken. No tears shed. But something shifted, like thaw under frost. Like a door that might, one day, open wider. Far above, pigeons stirred again. One dropped a feather that spun, weightless, to the ground. The ants would come soon, as they always did, drawn to forgotten sweetness. But for now, the sisters stood still, breath rising in twin clouds, holding the past in their palms. And somewhere in the abbey's courtyard, a bell rang again. Softer this time, like a memory returning. Smoke curled like a whispered curse from the chimney of the falconer's lodge, rising into the dusk sky where stars had not yet dared to shine. The wind dragged it eastward, across the still black surface of the moat, toward the high stone walls of the manor where torches flickered with laughter and roasted game. But here, just beyond the reach of silk and silver, silence ruled. Inside, the air was thick with musk and feathers. Hooks hung low from the beams, each one bearing a gauntlet, each one worn and darkened by blood. Cages lined the walls, shadowed things that blinked and shifted with slow, regal menace. The birds did not sing. They never did. Their cries were reserved for the kill. At the hearth, a boy stirred. His hands were red with cold, his sleeves stiff with straw. He moved slowly, deliberately, kneading together a paste of minced figs, rye flour, and rendered sheep fat. Each turn of the wooden spoon echoed in the stillness, soft as breath. This was not a meal for men. It was for the hunters of the sky, for talons and beaks, for feathers flecked with flesh. Yet hunger did not care for purpose. Not his. Behind him, the door creaked open. A gust of bitter air swept through as the steward passed, tall and grim with frost in his beard. "You eat that," the man muttered, voice like gravel, "and I'll have your tongue." The door slammed shut again, and the chill remained. He said nothing. He never did. Words were too dangerous here, but when dusk deepened, and the falcons slept with their heads tucked beneath the wings, and the master's boots no longer echoed across the stones, he dared just one finger. One taste. Fix sticky welt. The sweetness of figs, the grain of flour, the iron tang of dried meat. It was crude, nothing like the sugared wafers the nobles dropped from balcony rails into waiting hands. But it filled him. A warmth low in the belly, a memory of fullness. Outside, laughter rang out across the courtyard. He crept to the window, breath fogging the leaded glass. The noble children were playing again, wrapped in velvet and gold, tossing sugared hazelnuts into the air for a painted jester to catch with his tongue. The torches threw long shadows, twisting, stretching, dancing. Their world shimmered with warmth and candlelight, with furs and flattery. His world smelled of hay and hawk droppings, but food crossed boundaries. If not in body, then in dreams that he folded the remaining paste into a piece of old parchment. It had once been a page from a discarded hymn, still faintly marked with the Latin for mercy. He pressed it flat, then tucked it beneath the straw of his cot, beside the place where the cold never quite left. Above him, a falcon shifted. Its talons scraped wood. Eyes the color of old amber fixed on him, steady, unblinking. The same gaze it gave the hare just before the strike. The boy met its gaze and did not look away. Who was caged? Who was fed? Who watched, and who waited? The lines blurred in the half-light. He lay back on the cot, drawing his knees close, the scent of dried figs and feathers settling around him like a blanket. Hunger curled into his belly, not just for food, but for a world beyond this one. A world with honey, with softness, with names he could say aloud that I in the rafters. Wind moaned like an unanswered prayer. Somewhere, far off, a bell rang, faint, almost lost in the dark. Tomorrow, the falcons will fly again. Claws bared, eyes sharp, and he would clean their cages and knead their meat and feed them. But tonight he dreamed of sugared hazelnuts falling through the firelight, and in that dream, no one took his tongue. A drip of wax slid down the candle's edge and froze mid-fall, hardened by the breathless chill. Above, the vaulted ceiling groaned faintly, wood straining against time and cold. Shadows stretched long beneath the ribs of stone, cast by the low flicker of the hearth. No voice disturbed the stillness. Only the sound of ladles scraping pot bottoms, the muted thud of knife on root. Brother Elias stood closest to the fire, not for warmth, but for distance. From temptation. From judgment. From God, perhaps that he held a single walnut in his palm as though it might speak. That it had fallen that morning from the ancient tree behind the cloister, split slightly by frost, its wooden skin no match for the night's silent cruelty. A rare survivor. The squirrels had taken most. Children, the rest. And yet here it was, cradled in his hand like a confession. The brothers moved behind him in a quiet rhythm learned from decades of hunger and devotion. One stirred a thick pottage, leeks, barley, and scraps too tired to name. Another scraped blackened turnips beside a candle stiff with soot. No one asked questions. No one spoke of flavor. Lent required silence. And silence was a language they all had mastered. But behind the folds of Brother Elias's habit, stitched near the seam of his sleeve, was a secret. A dried fig. It had traveled across dust and sea, part of a trade from a distant caravan. A merchant wrapped in silks, offering relics and scrolls in exchange for inked gold. Elias had illuminated a psalter for the deal, every letter a breath of devotion, every vine a prayer. And for this small, shriveled fruit, He had bartered a month's worth of light and ink that he had not touched it. Not yet that he had waited. Through the rains. Through hunger. Through the prayers that never seemed to reach high enough to echo back. Now, beneath the breath of the fire, Elias placed the fig inside the hollow shell of the walnut. A monk's indulgence. Modest. Hidden. Almost invisible. As though, if wrapped in bark, even sin could be sanctified, that he brought it to his mouth and bit down. The crunch was quiet, but in the silence, it rang like glass breaking. His eyes closed. The fig was dense, sweet, but dry. Gritty with ancient sugar. The walnut, bitter and soft, clung to the roof of his mouth like earth. Together, they conjured something he hadn't tasted in years. Not sweetness. Not luxury. But memory. The clatter of dishes faded. For a moment, the kitchen disappeared. He saw his mother's hands, rough with flour, pinching dough into small round cakes. He smelled the herbs she crushed with stone. Heard the old hymn she used to hum when she believed no one listened. A melody now lost to the wind. His throat tightened. Then the bell rang. Not loud. But final. The summons. A reminder. He swallowed the last of the fig and placed the shell into the gray ash beneath the hearth, hiding it like a body. No one must know. The taste, the act, it had to vanish. Lent was for discipline. For deprivation. For cleansing. And indulgence, no matter how small, could not stand. But the air had changed. Above the hearth, a thin ribbon of sweet smoke rose slowly, curling toward the rafters. It mingled with the scent of burning root, beeswax, and wet wool. But it was there, just barely, like a whispered psalm between confessions that it would not linger long. Nothing did, and yet, something in it remained. A trace. A question that if a man breaks his fast in silence, in shadow, and no soul bears witness, is it sin, or survival? Brother Elias turned from the fire. The kitchen was as it had been, monks in silence, pots steaming, bread rising in cracked clay. But inside him, something had changed. A taste awakened. A memory stirred, and in the distance, past the cloister, a door creaked open. The scent of figs would not reach there. But the longing might. A wind moved through the broken shutters, soft but certain, carrying with it the scent of smoke, old stone, and something faintly sweet, like a memory forgotten and suddenly returned. The hearth had burned low. Just enough flame to paint the edges of the clay bowl she held in her lap. Her fingers, pale against the flickering light, gripped the bowl like a prayer. She was wrapped in a woolen shawl the color of mourning, gray not just from dye, but from the dust of years. Its threads held stories no one asked to hear anymore. Inside the bowl, thin slices of dried pear floated in a honeyed broth laced with vinegar and thyme. The smell was gentle, delicate, like the ghost of summer visiting winter's door. She stirred it with a wooden spoon, smooth at the handle, worn down by decades of quiet meals and careful hands. This was a widow's supper, simple, humble, eaten in silence. Outside, life thudded forward. Carts creaked down cobblestones slick with frost. A dog barked at shadows. Somewhere in the distance, a minstrel's tune danced through alleyways, cheerful and blind. The world beyond her door had not stopped, not for her sorrow, not for her hunger, but within these walls, time stood still. The pears had been sliced last autumn, dried on rush mats in the last warmth of the sun. She had once done it with her daughter, small hands passing her the fruit, giggling at bees that hovered too close. They had sung old songs together, made up stories about the pears as if they were royal coins or stars fallen to earth. That was before the fever, before coughing, before the long silence that followed. Now, she dried them alone. She raised a spoonful to her lips and chewed slowly. The fruit was soft, yet still held the whisper of texture. A chewiness that resisted for a moment, like her own heart. It tasted like summer, of sun, of something that once was. Each bite was a memory, each swallow, a farewell. Above her, on the shelf carved into the stone wall, a pewter plate caught the firelight. Its surface dulled by age, but still etched, just barely, with the image of a bird, wings outstretched in flight. It had belonged to her mother, and her mother before that. A lineage not of wealth, but of survival. She looked at it now, not as a relic, but as a companion. She did not eat out of hunger. She ate out of duty. The body must carry on, even when the heart has forgotten why. When the bowl was nearly empty, she rose, slowly, carefully, her knees aching like old hinges. The last of the broth she poured outside, into the soil near the kitchen door. Steam rose as it touched the cold earth, curling upward like incense, like breath offered to the night. The garden was bare now. Only the twisted arms of herb stalks remained. But she poured it anyway. Not out of waste, but reverence. The soil remembered. The roots would drink. Above her, the stars began to blink awake. One by one, as if unsure if they were welcome, she looked up at them, the cold biting her cheeks. There was no song, no prayer, just the quiet presence of a woman who had fed the earth, who had once carried life in her arms, and now carried it in her memory. The door creaked shut behind her, and the house, small and still, waited for morning. But even now, something moved just beyond the walls, just beyond the reach of warmth. That it was not joy, not yet, but perhaps the faintest stirring of hope. That a fly buzzed near his ear, slow and drunken from the heat. It landed on the rim of the barrel, then vanished into the dark brine below. Alaric didn't flinch. He crouched low, still as a prayer, hidden between the salted cheese and a heap of spoiling onions. The stone floor beneath him was cold, but his skin burned with hunger. Through a crack in the wall, golden light spilled across the scullery, light from a sun that celebrated others, not him. That in the courtyard, the world roared with midsummer joy. Bunting snapped in the wind. A harpist's melody fluttered like silk across the open air. Children's laughter echoed between the stones. But here, inside these walls of steam and sweat and sharp-edged hunger, Alaric was a ghost. He watched them from the shadows. Hands red with work, aprons stained with plum juice and goose fat. Cooks laughed over spitted meats. Flour bloomed in the air like holy dust. Saffron buns were being sliced with reverence, their golden centers warm and soft, glistening with melted butter. He could smell it. He could almost taste it. His stomach tightened again, sharp, curling, cruel, but to move was to be seen. And to be seen meant punishment. That he had seen the whip before. Not used in anger, but in order. In silence. As if pain were just part of the rhythm of the place, like the chiming bell or the clatter of pewter plates. So he stayed where he was, breath shallow, heart steadied in his pocket. He carried treasure. A sliver of honey cake. Dry and crumbling. Stolen days ago from the chapel's offering plate, taken with a whisper and a shaking hand. He had told himself that saints did not eat, that they did not need sweetness anymore. He broke a corner off with care. Let it sit on his tongue, letting it melt like snow on warm skin. The honey sang, not loudly but enough. Enough to stir the echo of a lullaby his mother used to hum. Enough to remind him of fingers that once wiped crumbs from his mouth with laughter, not scorn. Enough to remember that he had once been held. He chewed slowly. The scullery pulsed around him with life. Steam rose in clouds, knives rang against wooden boards, a goose screamed somewhere in the courtyard. Laughter came and went like the tide, but Alaric knelt still as stone, tasting what little he had. And in that moment, it felt holy. Above him, the rafters held bundles of dried herbs, sage, mint, yarrow, twisting gently as the warm air moved through. Their scents softened the salt and the fat. A spider traced the arc of its delicate web near a ladle, working in silence. Everything here had its purpose, even the spider, even him. Though no one had said so, he ran his fingers along the stone wall beside him, feeling the cracks, cool and ancient. He liked how they never changed, even as everything else did. The stone didn't care who was rich or fed or wrapped in silk. The stone endured. He pressed his forehead against it for a moment, letting it anchor him. Then the bell rang. One clear sound that split the noise like a blade. The servants were being summoned to wash before the feast. He had no role at the table. He would not taste the roasted apples or the dripping lamb or the honeyed cream, but he had eaten. He had tasted memory. And something sweet had lived in him, even if only for a moment. He stood, slowly, legs stiff from crouching. He tucked the last crumb into his tunic, near his heart. Behind him, the air smelled of yeast and fear. Ahead, the hallway yawned, long and shadowed. It led to the basin. The rags. The cold water that stung his skin. And beyond that, the laughter of nobles, clinking goblets, golden crumbs. He walked toward it all. Not in defiance, not in hope, just because the day still asked him to. Outside, a dove landed on the chapel roof. It cooed once, then turned its head skyward. The feast had begun, but the boy with the crumb in his tunic walked on, carrying something sweeter than bread. And far above the rafters, the spider spun that a crack echoed in the dark, soft, sudden, like a bone breaking in secret. The chestnut had split in the heat, its golden flesh peeking through charred skin, glistening with steam. The sound was small, but in that cellar, where even silence hung heavy as coal dust, it was loud enough to feel like guilt. Muriel flinched. She crouched lower near the hearth, her thin body curled inward like a question left unanswered. The flames licked the iron spit lazily, the embers pulsing red and dull orange, a tired fire, much like her. Her fingers, soot-streaked and shaking, hovered near the roasted nut. One more second, maybe two, and the scent would fade, lost to the smoke curling up the flue. But she couldn't look away. It smelled like autumn, like earth after rain, like something before sorrow. Her lips trembled. Then she did what she had promised herself she wouldn't do. She reached. She lifted the chestnut to her mouth. The skin bit back, scalding her tongue, but she didn't drop it. She bit down, careful, reverent. The taste bloomed slow, deep and sweet and smoky. She closed her eyes. For a heartbeat, she wasn't in the cellar. She was in the woods. Small hands in hers. Her mother was humming. Brown leaves crunching underfoot. The wind was cold on her cheeks. The time before she was Mouse. When she still had a name. When someone still called it. That a tear slipped down her cheek, hot as the chestnut. She swallowed, and just like that, it was gone. Above her, boots marched, steady, sharp, unkind. The rhythm of men who never bent to gather anything. Lords and guests, with bellies full and hands soft. Timber groaned beneath their weight as they passed. The manor was full tonight, feast for a hunt, laughter ringing in rafters carved with gold. But down here, stone, shadows. She wiped her mouth with the sleeve of her tunic, once cream-colored, now gray with grease and ash. The warmth still lingered in her throat. It felt like something alive. Something she might hold on to. For one more night. The spit turned gently, chestnuts crackling like tiny voices whispering through the coals. She counted them. Twice. Slowly. Lips moving with the numbers. Precision was protection. Mistakes meant the switch. Or no supper at all. One extra missing and she'd be found. And girls without names didn't get to explain. The bowl was heavy, carved of dark wood worn smooth by generations of hands that had long since returned to dust. She balanced it carefully, setting it on the low table with a thud muffled by damp air. Behind her, the broom leaned against a barrel, its bristles no more than splinters now. She had once tried to fix it, tying bundles of straw with old thread. But the straw had snapped, and the thread had snapped, and no one had noticed her try. Everything here was used until it broke. She touched the handle gently, like greeting an old friend who had suffered quietly beside her. Then the bell rang once. Chirp. Final. Mealtime. Not hers. She tucked the broom back into place, wiped her fingers on her apron, and stepped into the corridor that led upward. Up to the kitchens. Up to the stone stairs. Up to where firelight danced and meat roasted on spits taller than her. She would not taste any of it. Not tonight. Tomorrow, perhaps, if there were bones left with scraps. If she cleaned well. If no one was watching, but the chestnut's warmth stayed with her. A lullaby in her belly. A memory carved in smoke. A defiance no one would ever see. She walked in silence, bare feet on cold stone, her shadow stretching long behind her. The walls did not speak. They had no reason to. Somewhere, far above, a song rose. Fiddles and flutes. Cups clinking. Voices lifted in cheer. She climbed, and behind her, the fire died slow. The broom sagged. The cellar breathed again. But in the silence, something lingered, a name. Unspoken, but not forgotten. The wind outside howled low, like a wounded dog dragged across the moor. Inside, the hunter did not move. He sat with his shoulders hunched to the fire, knees bent, hands steady on the carved bone ladle. The pot bubbled softly, steam rising in slow spirals like smoke from a pyre. Nettle, bone, salt and thyme. It was the smell of endurance, not comfort. The kind of food made by hands that no longer hoped, only remembered. The roof creaked above him, heavy with moss and the weight of years. Drips of rainwater slid down the stones, cold as grief. Shadows danced across the walls. Shadows of old hunts, old prayers, old ghosts. Skins hung from the rafters, nailed in silence, stiff with age. Once living, now memory. Like the boys who once laughed here. Like the woman who once sang that he stirred again. The bone ladle scraped the bottom of the pot, softly, rhythmically, like a lullaby made of hunger. He dropped in the last strip of hare meat, salted so thin it might as well have been parchment. It curled in the heat, whispering as it cooked. There was no one left to share this with. And so he shared it with memory. On the stone beside the fire, rye crusts waited, dark and dry. He picked one up, rough and cracked like the skin on his hands. The marrow, boiled with wild garlic and pine ash, had turned to thick gold. He scooped it with a blackened nail, ritual more than hunger, and spread it across the crust. When he bit down, it gave way like old leather. The warmth bloomed in his mouth, rich, oily, bitter with smoke and thyme. It tasted like the forest, like old blood, like everything he had buried. He chewed slowly, eyes on the fire, listening. Because silence, he had learned, speaks in many voices. Sometimes it is the sound of a twig breaking far beyond the marsh. Sometimes it is the long breath of the wind as it curls through trees stripped bare. And sometimes it is a bird tapping once at your shutter, as if reminding you, you are not forgotten. Tonight the bird came. One tap. Then gone. He did not turn. Instead, his gaze settled on the table. An empty tankard, and a comb with half its teeth missing. Both worn, both untouched for years. But he still set them out. Night after night. Not for use. For presents. These were not tools. They were relics. Held not for their purpose, but for the hands that once held them. He reached for another crust. Dipped it again. His breath was steady now, drawn deep into lungs that had once shouted across valleys, once laughed through halls crowded with life. Now they sighed. He ate slowly. Without joy, but not without meaning. For each bite, there was a memory. In each sip, the echo of voices is lost. And in this solitude, there was a kind of reverence, grim, yes, but sacred. The kind that exists in places the world forgets. Out in the marsh, mist crept closer to the door, dragging fingers of fog across the threshold. The fire snapped once, and then settled into embers. He leaned back, resting his head against the timber wall, letting the marrow melt on his tongue. He did not pray. He did not speak. He remembered. Outside, the moon rose slowly behind drifting clouds, pale as bone, full as silence, and somewhere in the distance, deeper in the forest, a howl answered the wind, not wolf, not man, but something in between. He listened. Then closed his eyes. Tomorrow he will be trapped again. Skin again. Boil again. But tonight, the hunter fed not only his body. He fed the grief. He fed the memory. He fed the shadows. And the cottage at the marsh's edge stood still, half sinking in the mud, half held by the past, waiting for something older than forgiveness and hungrier than time. The frost clung to the convent like a second skin, thin, brittle, beautiful. Every branch was etched with white lace, every herb beneath the soil asleep in silence. The breath of winter lay heavy on the garden, quieting even the robins until the sun dared rise. Sister Anselma walked with slow purpose, her feet barely stirring the gravel beneath her. Her veil, damp with dew, clung to her shoulders like mist clings to morning trees. She was alone, and she was grateful. In her basket, simple, woven, fraying at the handle, were fragments of forgotten sweetness. A few dried apple slices, curled at the edges, a sliver of quince, sticky with cloves, rose hips like crimson pearls. Not enough to fill a meal, but enough to feed something else. She moved among the garden beds with reverence, fingers brushing low over frost-bitten thyme, over dead mint stems that still remembered summer. These were not just plants, they were memory, medicine, and mercy. Things grow slowly under care, then given freely. She sat at the old bench, the one worn smooth by decades of silent prayers, and the backs of women who once wept in the hours between bells. The wood was cold beneath her, but familiar. The rose hip was first. It cracked beneath her teeth with a bitter tang. Not unpleasant, sharp, wild, honest. It tasted like thorns and sun. Like something that had survived. She chewed slowly, the quince followed. Soft, perfumed. It stuck to her teeth and her tongue, leaving behind a whisper of cloves and something harder to name. Something warm, something lost. As it melted in her mouth, her mother's voice rose, not from memory, but from the marrow. Latin words, hummed in rhythm with a wooden spoon against a bowl. The scent of flower. The rustle of skirts. The warmth of arms that would never return. That voice had been taken by fever. Long ago. Long before vows and veils and silence. But here, in the garden's breathless stillness, that voice returned. Not as sound, but as feeling. A presence as soft as steam over tea. As fleeting as joy that a robin landed nearby. Its breast glowed like coal, red and brave against the frost. It hopped once. Then again. Then stopped, as if watching her. She did not move. She did not speak. She only breathed that I end this cloistered life, where the day was carved by bells and the night by prayers. It was these small moments that made her whole. Not the scriptures, not the sermons. But the silence between them. The curve of a quince slice. The color of a bird. She placed the last piece of dried apple into her mouth. It was soft now, warmed by her hand, sweet and smoky with age. As it dissolved, she closed her eyes. She did not pray for salvation. She prayed for softness, for sweetness, for a world where women could whisper their hunger without fear. Where they could speak desire without being named wicked. Where joy did not come as a sin, but as a right. She whispered that prayer into her hand, and the robin flew away. Far above the convent, smoke rose from distant chimneys. Winter held the land like a closed fist. But in the garden at that moment, something opened, not wide, but enough. The frost glistened on the stone wall like stars waiting to be named. And the bench, carved long ago by hands now dust, held her weight gently, as if remembering every woman who had ever sat, ever wept, ever hoped. Far off, a bell rang once. Not yet the call to prayer. Not yet the breaking of stillness. Just a note in the air, a reminder that silence, too, is sacred. And deeper in the convent, where shadows moved beneath candlelight, another sister opened her eyes, feeling, though she could not say why, that something in the air had changed, something quiet, something soft, and somewhere beyond the stone walls, beyond the frost-bitten herbs and the robin's trail, a knock would soon sound at the convent gate that a stranger would arrive, with hunger far heavier than memory. The storm had settled in with no intent to leave. Rain stitched lines down the chapel's stone walls, drumming a steady rhythm, like a monk's fingers tapping out a quiet penance. The world outside was soaked and dark, its edges blurred by cold and water. Inside, the air was thick with damp stone and extinguished incense. The traveler lay on the chapel floor, curled like a worn parchment, his breath fogging faintly in the cold air. His cloak clung to him, heavy, dripping, smelling of salt and earth. The road had followed him in. So had the silence. He reached into his pack, pulling out a small bundle wrapped in linen. Inside, his last kindness, a crude cake, pressed together with oats, suet, and a thin line of currant jam. It had been meant to last. It never did. The moment he broke it, a thin steam lifted, warm, fragile. The scent was something ancient, sour and sweet, like a memory half forgotten. He brought it to his lips and bit. The oats scratched, the suet clung, but the jam bloomed. Dark and red and sharp. It cut through the dullness like a song in a crypt. A taste like lullabies left behind. He closed his eyes. The candle by the altar trembled, casting crooked shadows against the wall, dancing saints and devils alike. The rain tapped the shutters like it was asking permission to enter. He did not move. He listened. The chapel was not holy. Not anymore. Time had worn down its edges. The saints in the windows had lost their faces. The pews were cracked and cold. But here, there was still shelter. Still stillness. Still the echo of something greater that he had come from the coast. His boots, crusted in salt and mud, bore the weight of miles. Every step had been a question. Every mile, a confession. He carried no name here, only tired limbs, a hollow stomach, and a heart too heavy to lift in prayer. The journey had not been to reach a place that it had been to leave something behind. Sin is a strange thing. It doesn't always come with fire or flesh or blood. Sometimes it comes in silence. In what was not done. In what was left unsaid that he didn't know if he'd sinned. He only knew that he couldn't sleep at night. That something inside him had curdled. That maybe if he walked far enough, it might drain from his bones and vanish into the road behind. That he reached down and broke the cake again, offering the second half to the ground. A beetle near his boot twitched, then inched forward. Even crumbs have purpose. Even hunger must be shared. Above him, in the wooden rafters, a pair of doves shifted softly. Wings brushed against beams. Their quiet cooing, barely audible, was like warmth humming through stone. That he pulled the cloak tighter, though it gave no comfort. The floor beneath him was cold, but it was honest. It asked nothing of him. It judged nothing. That he let his head rest back, let the sweetness linger in his teeth. Outside, the storm wept harder, but the chapel remained firm. Stones do not yield to rain. Not easily. Not quickly. He wondered if the chapel remembered the pilgrims who had once passed through. Women clutching holy relics, children with bleeding feet, old men with eyes fixed on death. Did it remember prayers whispered in fear? Secrets confessed between sobs? Or had the stone forgotten? Would it forget him? The doves grew quiet again. The candle bent low, and for a single breath, the world stilled. Peace does not arrive with trumpets. Sometimes, it comes with crumbs and cold floors. With the taste of jam on the tongue. With the sound of rain that drowns out the ache. That he did not know what tomorrow held. Only that this moment was enough. And somewhere, beyond the chapel walls, beyond the wet trees and the wind's morning cry, hooves would soon break the silence. A rider, carrying news no prayer could soften.